And inside cells, these reactions occur at a rate of thousands of events per minute. And the molecules are moving and colliding millions of times faster. Okay. So the point I'm trying to make is that we can't really conceive of atoms and these little molecules and how fast they can move and all that. So you just have to keep in mind that this is happening so that you can form bonds. When we get into things like enzymes, which we won't do today, but when we talk about enzymes, we'll see how that increases the chance of getting these chemical reactions to occur, so that you will form bonds. Okay. Anyway, so that's kind of what we're building up to, and I'm just trying to give you that idea. Not today, and we'll be doing that in the future. But I want to go back to some chemistry stuff I didn't get to. And this is not a real word, as I said. I think I mentioned to you last night. Chnop is not a word, but it's as close as we can get to a word. And those are the 6 most common atoms that are used to make up biological molecules. Well over 99% of all the atoms in biological molecules are these. And that's, I think I put this in the word last time, didn't I? Didn't I have one? Yes or no? Schnops? Yes. But anyway, let me just write it again. So C is carbon. H is hydrogen. N is nitrogen. O is oxygen.
P is phosphorus.
P is phosphorus. And S is sulfur. So those are the 6 most common elements. And notice that they're all fairly light ones. If you look in the periodic chart, they're pretty light ones. Other ones that are important, and there are a lot of them that are important. Also, I'll say also important are things like sodium, potassium. This is, this is not that I want you to memorize these. I just want you to be familiar with these. Chlorine, chloride, but I'll say chlorine. Calcium. I'm just going to say etc. Because there are a lot of others that are important too. Iron is important. Iron is very important for our red blood cells, so we can carry oxygen. We even have a little bit of cobalt that's in vitamin B12, so tiny amounts, trace amounts.
Oh, that's poisonous.
Iodine, we need that for thyroid hormones. So there's a lot of others important. Which reminds me, there is one other element I'm going to mention, just because I'm going to tell you another story. I like to tell stories. And this is molybdenum. If you look on the chart, molybdenum is what's over here? It's underneath chromium. It's got a 42 is its atomic number. Molybdenum, Mo. But I have to tell you a funny story because we do need a tiny trace amount of molybdenum. You don't need to know this. This is just for my story. It's just a funny word, molybdenum. And I worked for a professor at Berkeley, doing thermodynamic studies. And, one of the things they were working on was some system involving molybdenum. But they needed a secretary to come type up some of those stuff, an extra secretary, so they got someone from the secretarial pool to come type. She didn't know anything about chemistry. Why should she? But she's an excellent typist, so she's typing like. So she came across this. She'd never seen the word before. So the proper pronunciation is molybdenum. Okay. Here's her pronunciation: molybdenum. Isn't that beautiful? I just love that. Isn't that great? Molybdenum. So that's what she called it. Which reminds me of another story, and then I'm going to get back to the topic. And the other story is that I had this really great professor in physiology at Berkeley back in the 60s, and she was from a foreign country, so she had an accent. That's fine, I have the accent. Nothing wrong with the accent. Except that occasionally she had some unusual pronunciations of words. And this one, this is a lovely word here. We'll use this word. This is a common word. Periphery. Okay, that's a common word. Periphery just means on the outside. Her pronunciation was periphery. Isn't that beautiful? I just thought that was wonderful. Periphery. So every so often I'll talk about the periphery of the cell or something. Just and by the way, just to tell you something, she was the course she taught when I was an undergraduate in the 60s was physiology of development, starting from fetal development on up. I went back on sabbatical in the 90s. Actually, it was in the early 90s. To go to Berkeley and take some classes and do some computer stuff and all that. She was still teaching. Now she was retired, so she was a professor emerita as opposed to professor emeritus. That is, sexist, right? Emeritus means male, emerita means female. So she was a professor emerita. But I saw that she was still teaching, so I said, wow. And so, except in this case, she was teaching a course in the physiology of aging. I took it. It was an important class to take, needless to say. But and she was, it was packed. She was a popular professor then too. It's absolutely packed. This auditorium held between 500 and 1,000 students. It was absolutely packed. It's a huge class, and she was great. She was just great. I actually talked to her one time and told her that I was, on sabbatical, just taking some classes. And I said, I took classes from you back in the 60s. And she said, oh God, she was really excited about that. Back again, taking these classes. So, anyway, okay. So let's go on. This is I just mentioned those atoms.
Berkeley in the 60s. How'd you get any work done?
I have to memorize these atoms.
I didn't get any done in the 90s.
I want you to realize those are the most important in terms of just quantity. Those are the main ones that are used to make biological molecules. What I want to talk about real quickly, without going into detail today, we'll go into more detail in these topics, but just introduce them. Remember I said way back that first lecture, that's what, 3 weeks ago now? Yeah. So maybe you don't remember. Oh, well, maybe you do. And that is that biological systems, one of the things they do, they involve making chains. And this is sort of the idea of these macromolecules. Macromolecules, and again, the word means big, but keep in mind that that we're talking with respect to what? With respect to atoms, or with respect to the small molecules. So macromolecules are also called polymers. And that term is something you're familiar with because of, that you get all kinds of polymers, that make up like maybe the clothes you wear or something like that. And what is a polymer? A polymer is a long chain of whatever it is, but made out of individual molecules strung together. And some common way of putting these things together. In some cases, it may be the same molecule over and over again. It may be, in other cases, it may be different molecules, but they're formed in these long chains. And in terms of, making things like rayon and nylon and all these other things, they could make these polyesters or whatever, but there are chemical reactions involving making these long chains, and so you can make threads out of them or whatever, for making clothes. But in your body, we make all these macromolecules. We call them polymers, and they're made. I'll put this, they say long chains. Long chains of monomers. Where the monomer is the unit that you're using. You're using monomers over and over and over again to make a polymer. Okay, does that make sense?
Yes.
So when I put back, way back that first lecture, when I said that life assembles itself in chains, that's what we're talking about. Chains of these monomer units to make polymers. Long chains of monomers, that's just a plural. So let's just take the examples here. Proteins, that's the monomer. So that's the polymer, or macromolecule. So I'll use the word polymer.
Bless you.
So the polymer. The polymer is going to be these things coming down here, and the monomer unit that we make these things out of. Monomer amino acids. Okay. So So proteins then are made out of amino acids, and you string the amino acids together, and of course they fold and everything. We don't have to worry about that right now. But if I said to you, what are proteins made out of? The answer would be amino acids. All right. How many amino acids are there? By the way, it's a bit of a trick question. If you look in a book, they'll usually say 20, or sometimes they'll say about 20. There are actually many, many, many more than that, the number they'll give in a book. But there are usually 20, roughly 20 that are used to make proteins. So we make even more than that in our bodies. Our cells make more than that as intermediates or whatever. But so we'll say about 20 different ones. And keep in mind that to be technical, it's a lot more than 20, but those 20 that they talk about are the ones that are used to make proteins, right? They also use the word, they say that 8 of them, sometimes they'll say 9, are essential amino acids. What do they mean when they say that they're essential?
Your body doesn't make.
You don't make them, so you have to get them preformed in your diet. Where are you going to get them in your diet? Well, you can get them from animals, but where do those animals have the exact same metabolism you did? So they didn't make them, so they're essential in their diet. So where do the animals get them from?
Plants. Yeah.
So we get them from plants ultimately. But when we say essential, if you have any of the other 12, we'll just say 8. Sometimes we'll say 9, and there's reasons. But if you say there are 8 essential amino acids, that means given any amino acid, any of the other 12, you can interconvert that one to any of the other 12 if you need it. But those 8 that are essential, you have to get those in your diet preformed, because you can't make them if you don't have it. So that's why it's good. You need to have a balanced diet. If you eat meat, or dairy products or whatever, you're going to get more than enough of all the amino acids. But if you're a vegetarian, that's where you have to be careful to, get the right combination.
Eat grass.
Because certain plants will be. Now remember, when we say essential, it's essential to us, not to the plant. The plant makes its own. Doesn't have to get them preformed. It makes all 20 of its own. But for us, then, eating plants, if we're a vegetarian, we have to eat a combination of plants. Most plants have most of the amino acids, but they'll be maybe a little low on 1 or 2 of the essentials, but another might be higher now, but low on something else. And so you just eat a combination to get it. It's not a problem. So anyway, so proteins are the big molecules made of the small molecules, the amino acids. The next one we'll put out, we'll say carbohydrates. Or we can also call these polysaccharides. And as I said, we'll talk more about these in the future. This is just a quickie introduction. Carbohydrates, you can also say polysaccharides. The monomer units are individual sugars, simple sugars.
Simple sugars. There's a sugar battery now.
And so the glucose is one of the simple sugars, and if you put those together in the right way, you can make what we call starch if you're a plant, or glycogen if you're an animal. But we'll talk about that. So okay, another one of the nucleic acids. Oh, I keep changing colors.
You did go to Berkeley.
Nucleic acids. The two are DNA and RNA. So those are the big molecules again. The individual units that are put together to make the nucleic acids are called nucleotides. Again, we'll be looking at see what these look like in the future. There are 4 different kinds. 4 different types. Now that's not quite accurate again, but the 4 different ones that make DNA. 3 of those 4 plus another one that so it's a total of 4 to make RNA. We'll not worry about that right now. So I'll just say 4 different ones. Just keep in mind that it's not quite accurate.
Are those the strings?
The nucleic acid would be the string.
What's the nucleotides?
So that's the individual unit that's going to make it up. And we haven't talked about those. We will, and I'll show you pictures and all that kind of stuff. But no, so that's again, the nucleotide's a small unit. That's the monomer. That's the individual unit. And you string maybe 2,000 of those together to make a gene or something, or maybe a chromosome is made out of hundreds of thousands of nucleotides strung together. So in other words, these polymer units can be incredibly huge, long, and these are just the individual units. Each one's a unit, one simple unit. Now notice I put over here lipids in brackets. Lipids are usually talked about when we're talking about these because they're important molecules. They're not really a macromolecule. They're not really a polymer. So I can talk about lipids, but I'll just say over here that lipids aren't really polymers. But they're important to talk about, so I'm going to talk about lipids. So not actually, I'll say polymer. Okay. But they're very important. Yeah.
Is that because something's not repeated, like with a fatty acid? Like you might only repeat in structure?
Right. Well, I mean, the fatty acid itself is fairly long, but you don't. It's just you don't have one lipid hooked to another lipid hooked to another lipid to make some long lipid. I mean, they're fairly small, relatively small units compared to a protein and carbohydrate. So the kinds of lipids that we have in our body are things like so-called triglycerides. And I guess I didn't talk about it, but never mind. So triglycerides, steroids, etc. So these are fat derivatives, okay? And these are very important because a large portion of our cell membranes are made of lipids. So we will talk about those. Maybe I'll get to them today because I want to talk about. I may not get to it today because it's way down here at the bottom, but I might get to it today. But anyway, so we do want to talk about that, and I'll say something about it. I want to talk a fair amount about cell membranes actually. But so officially they're not under the macromolecule designation, but still these are the 4 important molecules that make up all kinds of things with your cells. Now, one very important idea I want you to have with respect to these, because I haven't really talked about structure, and I haven't talked about function, but we will be talking about structure and function as we go along. But let me just give you a couple of ideas because I think this will help you in terms of understanding the overall what's happening in your body, in your cells, how they're working. Here's the deal. In your cells, there are 2 very important molecules. I'll just put a circle on it. These are the ones I'm talking about. Oops, not those. Okay, already I made a mistake. Okay, let's say nucleic acids and proteins. So let's put proteins and nucleic acids. These are 2 very important molecules. Now, when I say this, I've got to be careful because you're going to say, "Oh, wait a minute, aren't carbohydrates and lipids important?" Yes, they're all important. I'm not trying to downplay the importance of the others, but there's something very important about proteins and nucleic acids that I want to just mention without getting into any details today. And that is that in terms of function of the cell, nucleic acids are informational. They don't do any work. They're information. So nucleic acids. No, we're talking about the DNA and RNA. These are informational molecules. I just said they don't do any work, which is mostly true. I mean, if you want to really be technical, that's not absolutely true. There are some nucleic acids do a little bit of work, but for practical purposes, for what we're talking about, they're information. Not a perfect analogy by any means, but somewhat analogous to a blueprint. The blueprint doesn't do any work, right?
Mm-hmm.
But it gives information to tell somebody else to do the work, how to put these things, what you're going to put where, okay? And the worker molecules are the proteins. These are worker molecules. Okay. They do all the work, and we're going to talk about that, probably some next lecture, but certainly the lecture after that we'll talk about. So the proteins are the worker molecules. The nucleic acids are information. There are all kinds of things that proteins do, and the way I usually say it is if when I'm teaching my physio class, I say, okay, if anything happens in your body, it's because some cell did some work. How are cells able to do work? It's the proteins in the cells that allow the cells to do the work. They're the worker molecules. They're the things that are actually doing whatever it is that are allowing the cell to do whatever the cell is doing. Okay, so just keep that in mind, that the proteins are the worker molecules. If I get down to this, if I get down to the cell membrane today, I'll talk a little bit about the proteins and what some of the jobs they do in the cell membrane. Then we'll talk about this other worker molecules too. But anyway, so just keep that in mind. DNA, let's just make it easy here to tie this together. We'll get back to, we'll do the RNA stuff in the future, but just for now, DNA, we said it's informational, right? So informational. DNA contains the information. I'll just say the info, okay, the information. The information about how to make the proteins. So the DNA, the information on DNA is to tell how to make the proteins. And then the proteins are the ones that do the work. So it's a little different using, I said that not a terribly good analogy of using a blueprint. The blueprint tells how to make a house. It doesn't tell how to make the workers that make the house. I mean, if it was a better analogy, then the blueprint would say, here's how you make the workers, and now the workers can, make the house. But that's not, so it's not quite the same. But anyway, so the information on DNA is how to make the proteins. You need RNA to make the proteins, and we'll talk about that in the future. But the point is that DNA is not doing any work. It's not to say it's not important. It's incredibly important because it's the information that tells how to make the proteins. It's also the information that's passed on generation to generation. So it's hereditary information. But for now, we'll just worry about it as being information on the proteins. All right, so that's enough on that. I want to just mention some functional groups because you'll hear about these words all the time. I'm not going to worry about the details about it, but I'll just give you a few functional groups. We've just been talking about chemistry. So these are some of the, and I showed you some, molecules, and I had things on them. I was attaching things to carbons and all that. So here are some things that you will see as you start reading the textbook or whatever. So these are just some, many, many, many functional groups. I would say some functional groups. In chemistry, except that in particular, we're thinking chemistry, biological chemistry. Biochemistry, that's a different term. But you'll see these all the time. For example, if you see an OH, that's called a hydroxyl. You don't need to worry about anything in details about this at all right now. But just if you just look at these, just see something about them. Here's a carbon hooked onto oxygen by a double bond, hooked onto a hydroxyl group, and that's called carboxyl group. And the little dash I have there means it's attached to something. Maybe it's attached to a carbon, for example. This is just something that might be attached to a carbon. And if you have just an OH attached to a carbon, it's said to be a hydroxyl group. They also call it an alcohol group because all the alcohols, that's what every alcohol, and there are a lot of different kinds of alcohol, has an OH attached to it. Okay? By the way, there are all kinds of alcohols. There are hundreds of different alcohols. there's one kind that you can drink. And it doesn't kill you. Well, unless you do overdose, and that's ethyl alcohol. And that's the kind that's in wine and beer, and bourbon and all that kind of stuff. That's ethyl alcohol. That's if you drink that in moderation, you're okay. Any other kind of alcohol, and a lot of them, there's propyl alcohol and butyl alcohol and isopropyl alcohol, and you can go on and on and on. There's hundreds of different kinds of alcohols. They're all poisonous. All those others are poisonous. Drink those things, you're dead. I mean, some will kill you, ruin your liver in a matter of no time, or whatever.
Touch of butyl, yeah.
So just keep in mind that there are all kinds of alcohols, but we use some of them, for disinfecting things and surfaces. It's perfectly good for, like isopropyl alcohol is used a lot in hospitals to clean things. Methyl alcohol is used for various things. So anyway, whatever. Okay, here, an amine group. I just said I have over there amino acids. All amino acids have an amine. An amine group is a nitrogen up to 2 hydrogens. That's what an amine group. And when we talk about amino acids in the future, I'll show you that there is, there are 20 different ones, but they all have a certain part of it the same. They all have a hydroxyl group and an amine group. This hydroxyl group can be acidic. Going to give off hydrogen, so it can be acidic, so we call them amino acids because they all have those parts. We'll come back to that. You don't need to know now. And then phosphate. You take the phosphorus, the atom phosphorus, then you hook on things like oxygen, hydrogen, and oxygen, hydrogen. Those are hydroxyl groups. And the double bonded oxygen here. That's called phosphate. So it's phosphorus with those hydrogens and oxygens hooked on to it. Okay? I usually draw it, because that's the common in biochemistry. Instead of trying to draw out all those things, I'll usually draw it as a P with a circle around it. So that's the way I'll draw it. It's just a convenient shorthand way of drawing phosphate. So even though P stands for phosphorus, the atom, when I put a P with a circle around it, just from now on, and I'll remind you of this in the future, but just think, hey, he's talking about phosphate, which is this larger unit that contains, the phosphorus atom, plus, some oxygens or hydrogens or hydroxides, that are bonded to it. Covalent bonds, these are all covalent bonds. All right, that's enough on this functional groups. Let's start talking about cells. Cell, the basic unit of life. All living things are made of cells, okay? This is a big deal. Nowadays, so we know that, big deal. But, 150 years ago, I said this we talked about it somewhat. They didn't know what made up life. I said it was kind of like a black box. We could see we're functioning as units, but we don't know how we eat, but we don't know what's happening to food that goes in. We don't know anything's happening inside the body. But once they discovered the microscope and they started looking at things, they started seeing cells, and eventually, various biologists were saying, "Hey, it seems like everything is made of cells." We kind of talked about this a little bit that first lecture. And so now, it's absolutely the case that all living things are made of cells. Where do cells come from? From pre-existing cells that grow and divide. In other words, you can't just take all the contents of cells and shake them up in a bottle and expect to have a cell. It's not going to work that way. We're talking about things that evolved over millions and millions and millions of years. But anyway, but once you have a cell, that these things grow and divide, so that's how you get new cells. Okay, so there are cells. So we're made of cells. Everything is made of cells. But then, as they started doing more work and, using not only the regular microscopes to see things, but using electron microscopes and getting more sophisticated, it became obvious that there were two basic types of cells. Two fundamental different kinds of cells. They're still cells. They still grow and divide. That's how you get new cells out of them. But the two fundamental types of cells. The two, I'll say, basic types of cells. So one kind is called prokaryotic. And the other kind is called, I'm just going to put a little bit about these things. I'm not going to put too much information because we will be talking about some of these in the future. The others are called eukaryotic. By the way, this distinction really started in the 1960s before they really kind of realized this, and then they kind of started to make sense out of it. First of all, the words pro and carry and all that. I think didn't we talk about this once before, as I recall, but the word pro means before. Okay? So the pro part, the little prefix pro means before. I remember telling you about carry, though. Carry means nucleus. I think that's a word meaning kernel or nut, if I remember correctly. But anyway, nucleus is what it refers to. The EU comes to the word meaning good, or in this case, true. Of course, then we still have nucleus here again. Okay, so prokaryotic and eukaryotic. There are only two kinds of organisms. They're really the same. They're really it's one kind of organism, but we split them into two groups that are made of prokaryotic cells. These are bacteria. Bacteria and the blue-green bacteria. I did mention this to you before, as I recall. Bacteria, the blue-green bacteria. These are the only cells that are prokaryotic. So officially, then, only bacteria, because blue-green bacteria are bacteria. And I think I mentioned to you that you can buy, it's supposed to be this miracle supplement that's going to solve every problem you've ever had and some that you don't even have yet. Blue-green algae.
Yeah.
Now, if you are selling it, you make a lot of money. I'm sorry to offend you. If you're buying it, and spending money, I'm sorry to offend you, but I'm going to offend you because first of all, I mean, I had two people that tried to sell me the blue-green algae, and I said, they're not algae. They're bacteria. So would you send me your brochure? So they sent me the brochure, and I read it, and the science was a little questionable. There are a lot of all kinds of scientific, not just the fact that they're not algae. There are such things as algae, but algae are eukaryotic. So but the old days, we called them blue-green algae. We did call them that, back 20, 30 years ago. No, more than 20 or 30 years ago, 40 years ago. But not anymore. They're called the blue-greens. They're also called cyanobacteria. Cyan is the color of most of them. Cyanobacteria. So, but anyway, but besides the fact that the blue-greens, they're not, besides the fact that they are bacteria, not algae, reading the other things, and I'm going, wait a minute, there's certain problems with it. The people that sold it claimed that they harvested this in this beautiful Klamath Lake and it's all pure. And blue-greens grow where there's a lot of stuff that they can use to grow, which usually means the more contaminated it is, the better they grow. Some blue-greens, now the kind that they were using in their supplement, it's perfectly fine. It's not going to hurt you a bit if it's pure. But some blue-greens make toxins that are nasty. They can make you very sick. Some are even deadly, but they can make you pretty sick. And the problem is, they weren't growing these blue-greens in, monoculture, meaning pure. They're harvesting them from a lake. And they just can't get it pure enough. I wouldn't trust it, in other words. They just can't get it pure enough. And they said in their brochure, sometimes people will get sick after using it. Well, that's because it's pulling out all their toxins. They haven't, they're getting toxin from what their supplement, unfortunately, but it's because it's not as pure as they'd like to pretend. Yeah. See, I'm stepping on toes already, aren't I?
Well, no,
good.
The blue-green algae that they say in the river, like every summer, like blue-green algae, that's blue-green bacteria.
Yeah.
Blue-green
That's right, the blue green.
Kill your
bacteria.
dogs if they drink the water.
And there are in a lot of different kinds of blue greens. The kinds that they were selling in their supplement is a specific species, genus of species. I can't remember what it is, but there are a lot of other blue greens. One, just for your interest, you don't need to know this for my purposes, but all blue greens, all of them, all photosynthesize. And give off oxygen. It's nice. Because you usually think of plants as photosynthesizing and give off. Yes, they do. They photosynthesize and give off. And algae photosynthesize and give off oxygen. But those guys all have little chloroplasts inside them. Okay. When we talk about the origin of chloroplasts, they think that chloroplasts originated from one particular blue-green bacteria. Kind of why. Anyway, by the way, some non-blue-green, some bacteria that are not blue-greens can photosynthesize. Not all, most of them don't, but there are some other varieties of bacteria that photosynthesize. They don't give off oxygen. They'll give off other things. They may give off hydrogen and the various other things they might give off. So photosynthesis, it doesn't just give off oxygen, but the majority of organisms, I mean plants and algae and all those, and all the blue-greens, they all give off oxygen. That's a good thing. This is good. That, by the way, that wasn't the case. You know, these guys didn't exist. The photosynthesis giving off oxygen didn't exist at first. It was a while before the blue-greens developed, and once they started to develop, then they started giving off oxygen. Then the oxygen in the environment started to increase and increase and increase, and that allowed all kinds of aerobic organisms, such as all these eukaryotic cells, allowed them to start increasing. And by the way, you know, as far as the oxygen in the environment, probably, you know, who knows exact numbers? No one knows for sure, but probably roughly 50% of it is made by plants and algae and all that, and the other 50% probably made by blue-greens. These are all single-celled organisms living on their own. Okay. So, in other words, if you killed off all the organisms in the rivers and ocean and all that, our O2 level will probably drop in half fairly quickly because we only have land-based plants to make the oxygen. It might drop, and it may be that the numbers are more than 50% from the blue-greens and algae. I don't know. You know, but they make a huge amount of the oxygen. Very good guys. I mean, these are good. But they can, as you said, in the summertime, overgrow in things, lakes, and put out some. They're still going to photosynthesize, but they can give off toxins, and then you want to be careful. You don't want to drink that water. Or you don't let your doggy drink the water because they can get very sick. There are other organisms that make the dinoflagellates, which are protozoan type things. They can make the red tides. That's a different thing, but they're not a blue-green. Yeah.
I heard that there was a big bloom of blue-green algae right at the Mississippi Delta from all the farmers.
All the stuff they're putting in.
And then
all
the
those
algae are eating it and then killing the fish.
Yeah, I know. And it allows these other things to overgrow. No, there's a kind of getting to be a dead zone around the delta and everything. It's true. It's true. And it's worrisome. I mean, you know, they would like that not to happen because it's not a natural thing to happen. So
that's not algae either, right?
It's what?
But that's not algae either.
No, it's splash.
I know. No, it's probably it's a combination of things. I mean, I think there's probably blooms of blue-green, probably blooms of algae, blooms of things like the dinoflagellates that make the red tide. There's a combination of all of these that start to overgrow if you give them all those nutrients. It's kind of like, I do take a vitamin supplement. My doctor recommended, so I do take a vitamin supplement just to make sure I eat a good diet. So I don't think I need it. But on the other hand, I'm well aware that with all of us taking vitamin supplements, that makes our output poop. You know what I'm talking about? Yeah, that's the stuff. Anyway, very rich. There's a lot of vitamins and things like that in the feces. So we probably have a very rich sewage system, as far as what's in it. So that's a lot of things grow. But whatever. That is a problem. Back to these things. So eukaryotic cells. Well, I tell you what. Let me just put up here, since the word here is before. That's before. What was that word? Put that up. It's supposed to be before.
We knew it.
Now we have it correct. Okay, sorry. Before nucleus. So just one fact about these, and this is just one of the facts. We'll talk about more in the future. No nucleus. Whereas all the eukaryotic cells have a true nucleus.
Wait, so the prokaryotes don't have nucleus.
Correct.
Why is nucleus in the title then?
I'm sorry. Why? What?
Why is it before nucleus? Why is nucleus?
I mean, that's the name. It means that these guys, probably all these guys, or at least the relatives of those guys, are the earliest organisms on Earth. And they didn't have a nucleus. And sometime, maybe about 1 billion years after they formed, somehow these eukaryotic cells formed, and they have a nucleus. What you can really recognize as a nucleus, you can see in the microscope, and we'll talk about mitosis and all that, which eukaryotic cells do. Prokaryotic cells don't do that because they don't have a nucleus. Yeah. And there's all kinds of other things. I'll just mention, I won't write it down because we'll do it in the future. Bacteria have one chromosome, and it's circular, one circular chromosome. I'll write this down in the future because you don't need it now. But one circular chromosome. Whereas eukaryotic cells have pairs of linear chromosomes, not circular, linear pairs. They all come in pairs, one from mom, one from dad. You know? Or if you're a plant, from the plant's mom, the plant's dad. You know? But so that's just one. But there's a lot of other differences. We'll come back to that. But these things that have a true nucleus, and these are all other organisms are made of eukaryotic cells. All plants, in other words, plant cells, animal cells, fungi, algae, true algae, of course, protozoa, various things like that. All these little, So in other words, most of the different kinds of cells you might be familiar with. And by the way, a lot of these are single-celled. Fungi, algae, protozoa, those are mostly single-celled organisms, but they're eukaryotic cells. Essentially, all bacteria, blue-grains are single-celled. They just happen to be prokaryotic organisms. Okay. So, two fundamental types of cells. We'll concentrate more on eukaryotic cells, just because, partly it's because animal cells, and that's us, right? We have our cells are. But we'll concentrate on that. Plus, they're a little more complicated. I don't want to say they're more interesting because I already gave you the mantra that we have in the microclass. Bacteria rule. So I don't want you to think that bacteria aren't interesting. They're incredible. And we wouldn't exist without them because of all the cycles of nature, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Some bacteria cause diseases, and in my microclass we stress those more because it's a medical microclass for nursing. But not all bacteria are harmful. In fact, most bacteria are not harmful. Only a small percentage are. But some of the bacteria that are harmful are pretty nasty. So they're interesting. Now, what's not listed here? What's not listed on the animals and plants and fungi and all that kind of stuff?
Viruses.
Viruses. Remember we talked about viruses. So viruses aren't listed, and the reason is that viruses are not cellular. In fact, I will give you the term for them. They are obligate. This is great. You like obligate? Intracellular parasites. That's what viruses are. Obligate intracellular parasites. Parasite, that's a bad thing, right?
Yes.
Bad things to you, doesn't do anything good.
Takes things away.
Intracellular, intra means within.
In the cell.
Inter means around, but this intra. So inside cells, obligate means it has to. It says it has to be inside a cell. That's what obligate means, has to. Inside a cell, intracellular. Parasite, bad. Causes some problem. Might kill the cell. But basically, so Viruses, what they do, they get inside cells, they take over the cell, and they make the cell become a virus factory. That's basically what they do. We'll talk about them in the future, but just for now, just that's enough for now. Just to tell you, the viruses don't do any work. They can't metabolize on their own. They can't reproduce on their own. They don't do any work. What they do is, guess what they're made of? Protein, the protein coat, and inside it, DNA, or sometimes RNA. And so they're just what one scientist called them is bad news in a protein shell. Because what it is, they have this protein shell, and they get to the cell they want to infect, they get their DNA, say, or RNA into the cell. That tells the cell to make new viruses. So the cell doesn't do anything. The virus doesn't do any work. It just brings in information, nucleic acid information, to tell the cell how to make new viruses. And in the process, many times it kills the cell. After the cell's done the job, the cell dies. Virus doesn't care. All it cared about was having
replicated itself.
You know? Now, I'm saying care as if it had feelings. Of course, it doesn't. But if you understand what I'm saying. So they're not made of cells. They're biological entities because they're made of proteins and nucleic acids. Sometimes they have kind of a membrane around them too. We call it an envelope. But again, are they living? Remember we talked about this way back the first lecture, I think, or second lecture. Are they living? It depends on how you define life. And most of the ways we define life, you'd probably say they're not living, or they're kind of on that in-between state of being sort of almost living, but sort of not really living, and so they're kind of in between. They're certainly biological entities, but do they conform to the definition of life? Depends upon how you define it. And you can define life so they would be living. It's up to you. It's not a big deal. Whatever. All right. Let's talk about cells. So and right now what we're going to do is we'll talk about eukaryotic type cells. And we will come back in the future to bacteria. And as I said, I think bacteria are fascinating. I think viruses are really fascinating, and that's what I did my master's work was on tumor viruses, cancer-causing viruses. So they're fascinating critters, but we're not going to talk about those right now. So let's talk about eukaryotic cells. Simple picture. I'm just going to go like this. That wasn't a very good picture. Another simple picture here. So we're going to say, hey, here is the cell membrane. And then what's inside? Well, we'll say cytoplasm. And we'll put a nucleus in there. We'll put other things into it in a minute, but and we're going to talk about some of these things in a little bit of detail. But here's the deal. Cytoplasm. First, let's talk about the cytoplasm. You think of it as a watery substance, but it contains all kinds of things dissolved in it. So it has more the consistency of a gel than it does of water. Like Jell-O. Jell-O. What is Jell-O? What is Jell-O made of, by the way? Water, obviously, but what's in it?
Marrow.
What'd you say? Collagen. What's collagen from? Collagen is the most common protein made by the animal kingdom. The most common protein in our bodies. And it's the word collagen means glue forming, to make glue. And what do they do to get, the old idea was if when a horse died, you took him to the glue factory. Well, they do. They take him where they boil the hides, they boil the hooves and all that, and they extract things out of it like collagen. And collagen is what is in Knox gelatin. If you get Knox gelatin, doesn't have to be the brand Knox, but gelatin, what that is collagen. It's just collagen from horses' hooves and hides and all that kind of stuff. Strong, tough protein. you can boil it and it will dissolve. But if you treat it, it's called tanning, not tanning from the sun, but using tannic acid, it'll change its structure so then you can't boil it. And that's what you do to the hide of an animal. They tan it, and then there's a lot of collagen in skin, and you treat it so it doesn't dissolve, then you have this tough stuff we call leather, tough, strong stuff. Good material. Yeah.
And that goes to the stuff that is made when you like make stew out of like
Oh yeah. So if you make stew and you boil and boil and boil, you get a tough piece of meat, and it's tough because it has a lot of collagen. That's strong, non-stretchy stuff. And you boil it to make stew, and that boils it out, and then the gelatin that forms on top, that's mostly collagen, almost not pretty close to being pure collagen. Yeah. And it's perfectly fine to eat it, or if you don't want to eat it, I mean, as I said, you can use it to make Jello if you wanted to make some kind of gelatin dessert. That's exactly
beef Jello.
But anyway, so why did I get on? Oh yeah, so I was saying, I couldn't remember why I was on this topic now. Yeah, I was on the topic because I was saying that when you make like gelatin, what you're doing is taking a lot of these collagen molecules and you're dissolving them in the water. And there's so many that it gets nice and thick, and we call it gelatin. It's nice and thick. Or if you're brand name Jello, but that's what they have in a whole bunch of Jello. Well, that's more or less the consistency of the cytoplasm. It's really gel-like because it's got all kinds of proteins inside. They're all dissolved in there. Okay. So cytoplasm is water plus dissolved stuff. I know stuff is not, that's not the proper scientific term, so I put it in quotation marks. This is all stuff, okay? But those dissolved things can be proteins, amino acids, sugars, all kinds of things dissolved. So it's fairly thin. Plus, it has, the other things that are in there to make it what we would call cytoplasm. It contains the organelles and stuff like that, and the cytosol. The cytosol, when they use the word cytoplasm or the way they use the word cytosol would be mostly the water and some of the dissolved things, but not the other stuff that's in the cytoplasm. So let me use this word, because you'll see the word cytosol. I won't use this term, the cytosol. I'll use the word cytoplasm. Cytosol is like cytoplasm, but doesn't include the organelles. I haven't talked about the organelles yet, but let's talk about that. I've mentioned that once before.
Yeah.
So if you read the word cytosol, you can more or less say that that's the same thing as cytoplasm. Technically not exactly the same, but is that a big deal? No, they're a little bit different, but whatever. So most of the time I'll just use the word cytoplasm. So what's cytoplasm? The stuff inside the cell. We have a cell membrane. The cell membrane is a barrier, so it separates the outside world from the inside world. Okay, and this is an important barrier. I'm going to say more about the cell membrane, and I did mention this once before to you, but it's an active part of the cell. We have a barrier in this room. I've mentioned this to you that it's a barrier. It's a wall and the doors, but it's pretty passive. It's just sort of there. You may have an opening, so heat may be coming out somewhere. Like maybe in the ceiling, say, you may have heat coming out or something like that. But you're not going to come over here, walk by this opening, which is a door, or maybe one of the windows, and have yourself be something pulled outside the cell, or have someone's walking outside. Go outside the room, or someone's walking outside the room, and suddenly the door grabs a hold of that person and brings them in. Right? That doesn't happen. In other words, the door's passive. You can open it and you can shut it, but it's passive. It's not doing anything. But when we talk about the cell membrane, you're going to see that it's an active part of the cell. It's doing a lot of work. In fact, it's the cell membrane that's going to determine what's inside the cell versus what's outside the cell. And, in your own body, you have kidney cells, and liver cells and brain cells and stomach cells and blah, 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 all these different kinds of cells. A large thing, I mean, one of the main things that makes these cells different from each other is what's in the cell membrane. So we'll talk about the cell membrane in a fair amount of detail. But so the cell membrane is, this barrier. And we'll, as I said, we'll say more about the cell membrane. But it's the barrier that keeps the outside out, the inside in, but allows things to get through in some ways. The other thing that you'll hear with reference to is the cytoskeleton. And you know the skeleton in your body, it's the internal skeleton, and everything's, your muscles are attached and everything like this. Well, it turns out that there are all kinds of proteins that help to keep the cell shape, help to keep it, in the nice shape and the size and everything else. And so the cytoskeleton then is, it's kind of this, we'll say, mostly proteins. I say mostly because it can have some carbohydrates can be part of the cytoskeleton, and even some lipids too. But mostly proteins that maintain the shape and everything of the cell.
Is this what cholesterol would be, or is that?
It's in the cell membrane. It's part of the cell membrane, yeah. And animal cells have cholesterol in the cell membrane. Plant cells don't. Just one little thing.
So where is the cytoskeleton? Is it like
You don't see it unless you stain it. You have to put certain stains to stain this. And yes, you'll have various kinds of. See, we haven't talked about the cell membrane, but there are proteins in the cell membrane, and there'll be proteins inside. There'll be all kinds of crisscrossing of these things. Yeah. And each cell is going to, they're not all going to look alike in terms of cytoskeleton. It's just something to think about in terms of various kinds of proteins that help to maintain the shape. That's all. I'm not going to make a big deal about it, but you'll see it's reference to cytoskeleton, so I want to at least mention it to you. I probably won't say anything about it again, because from my perspective, it's not that critical for us, other than to just in the back of your mind realize there is some kind of internal structure that keeps that cell the normal shape and size and everything. But details of it we don't need to worry about. But yeah, you'll see pictures if they stain it in a certain way, and you look in textbooks, and you'll see all these different guys. But for our purposes, not a big deal. So let's, I think, maybe I'll start with the cell membrane. I'll tell you about organelles next time. Start with the cell membrane. I'll talk about that. The cell membrane is very important. So the cell membrane. It's got several names, by the way. Most of the time, I will use the word cell membrane, just because that's the old term, and it's just easy for me to use. Occasionally, I use the newer terms. One is plasma membrane. Or plasma lemma. That's the new fancy term. And, it depends upon, if you're reading a book, it depends upon the author. If they want to use the newer names, they'll say plasma lemma or plasma membrane. It doesn't matter which one you use, they all mean the same thing, okay? So just as long as you realize that, which one you use, fine. Use the fancy plasma lemma if you like. I like that. But usually I'll just say cell membrane, whatever. It's all the same. Cell membranes are very similar with all eukaryotic cells to a great extent. Cell membranes in general are very similar in the sense that they're made of phospholipid bilayers, but proteins also. The proteins usually get shortchanged in descriptions. I don't want to shortchange them. So cell membrane is made of a phospholipid bilayer plus protein. And it's about 50% each. Half and half. 50% phospholipid bilayer, 50% protein. I mean, it's not like it's magic number 50%, but I mean, roughly half, half, and half. The point is that if you read in a textbook, they'll emphasize the phospholipids and mention the proteins. And I want you to realize that, hey, the proteins are absolutely critical for the way the membrane works. But let's start with the phospholipid bilayer. And we can come back to this figure. That's a simple picture. Gosh, you can't get much simpler than that. Let's start with phospholipids. Let's start with lipids. Let's start with a common lipid that we make to store in our fat cells. You know, we have cells, their whole function, adipose cells, their whole function is to store fat. And I just wanted you to know that fat gets a bad press. I know that. I understand that. We absolutely need fat. I mean, it's not, you know, I don't want you to think fat's bad. It's not bad. And, you know, here's the deal. We're basically hunter-gatherers. There are still peoples in this world who are, as their mode of existence is hunter-gathering. But you know, here's the difference. We are still, you know, in the hunter-gatherings, they gather, they'll gather roots and berries and that kind of stuff, or they go out hunting for
and they have O negative
some
blood.
kind of animal or some of that. So those are hunter-gatherers. But here's the difference. We are still hunter-gatherers, but there's a difference in how we do it. What we do now is we get into our car, we drive down to Safeway, and we hunt for a parking place, and then we go into Safeway and we gather up all the food and put it into our cart. So we're very efficient. And from our body's perspective, you know, what you want to do, you know, you want to have energy to survive. Well, if you think back in the old days, or even in the modern hunter-gatherers, they don't necessarily have an abundance of food. So let's just say they were really fortunate. They killed some fairly large animal. Then they eat it. They eat it, and they eat it, and they eat it. And all the extra food that they eat that they aren't going to use right now, they'll store. Most of it's going to be stored as fat.
Mm-hmm.
And the idea, and as I said, you have cells that do that. They're called adipose cells. That's their job, is to store fat. Then it may be, let's say you're going out on a hunting expedition. You may go for a week or more before you really find anything to eat. But you've got that stored fat to use, and so you use that stored fat up until you get some more food. That's just fine. Our problem is that our bodies are still working the same way, and you eat extra, and then we'll store that extra as fat, and we're waiting to use it. But then we store some more as fat. We haven't used up what we stored. Oh, then we store some more. We haven't. Well, we know about this, so we have ways of trying to get rid of it. Well, diets now. But anyway, the point is that the whole idea from your body's perspective is when there's excess, store it in case we don't have anything to eat. So it's a very important idea. It's just that in a modern society we have excess, far more than we need. Back to lipids. So don't think the lipids are bad, but the main way we store lipids is the main lipid to be stored is called a triglyceride. Okay, now triglyceride is made of 3-carbon sugar, carbon sugar, called glycerol, plus 3 F period, A period, stands for fatty acid. So, now what is a fatty acid? Fatty acids are long. Did I show you this the other day?
No.
I didn't think I did. Long chains of carbons and hydrogens. When I say long chains, typical in our bodies, it might be 16 or 18 carbons long. That's a long chain of carbons. So this could be, as I said, could be 16 to 18 carbons long. So it would look like this. So fatty acids look like this. Sorry. Carbon, carbon, carbon. Not just for dot, 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 carbon, carbon. By the way, at the very end of the last carbon happens to have a double bonded O and an OH, but you don't need to worry about that. But all of these carbons just have hydrogen done. I'll just put little bonds like that. I'm not putting anything there. But everywhere there's a little bond symbol, that means there's a hydrogen there. And as I said, this long chain here might be as long as 16 to 18 carbons. So now let's take our sugar, our glycerol, or glycerin. You've heard of glycerin probably. Glycerol, glycerin, 3-carbon sugar. Sweet, very sweet. So let's do this. So it would be like this. So here would be, that's the glycerol. That's the 3-carbon sugar. I'm not going to put all the bonds on here. And then hooked onto it is fatty acid, fatty acid, fatty acid. So this is the way we store fat. Okay. These long chains of fatty acids hooked onto a 3-carbon glycerol. Right?
Mm-hmm.
And as I said, these are long chains. My drawing would be like way up to here. So long chains. Okay, what I have over here is, I erased it, but I said that cell membranes are made of phospholipids, okay, and proteins. What is a phospholipid compared to a triglyceride? So this would be a triglyceride. I'm going to convert it into a phospholipid. Here we go. Very easy. I'm going to put a P right here. Because the circle around it is a phospholipid.
Just change one of the fatty acids.
So I took away one of the fatty acids. Instead, I put that P with the circle. What that P with the circle stand for?
Phosphate.
Phosphate. So when it's, use the adjective, it would be phospholipid. So now this is a phospholipid. And these long chains of fatty acids, they don't like water. Did you get that in lab the other day? Hydrophobic. Okay. So fatty acids, hydrophobic. But because that phosphate can ionize, it likes water. So the phosphate is
Hydrophilic.
Now the way they draw this in a textbook, to make it simple, they will draw this phospholipid. They'll draw like this. They'll say, okay, here's the phosphate head, and here are the phosphate use the same color. This is the fatty acid tail. So these are the fatty acid tails. This is the phosphate head. I made the tails really long in this, but whatever. So the phosphate head and the fatty acid tails. Now, what the phosphate likes water. Fatty acid tails don't like water. All right. In a cell, there's always water inside the cell, and most cells there's water outside the cell. Especially if you're living in an ocean or a river, if you're a single cell. But even in our own bodies, there is water inside. Always water inside the cell. That's in the cytoplasm. But there's also water outside the cell. It could be interstitial fluids or whatever. But there's water inside cells, water outside cells. The phospholipids that make up the cell membrane. And I said it was a bilayer. Did I say that? Phospholipid bilayer. 2 layers. Well, what happens is this: if I just said this is a cell membrane like this, there's a cell membrane. If I look at just a little tiny piece of it right there, and looking at it cross section, what they'll do, they'll say, okay, here are the phospholipid. I mean, those are the phosphates. Here are the tails, fatty acid tails. Now they're going to be a lot closer than I'm drawing them. I'm drawing kind of space between them, but they'd be a lot closer. So this is just a cross section. So that's one layer, and here's the other layer down here. And we can move over now. We're going far away. Okay, so this is the phospholipid bilayer. Okay, with the and we'll say this is the outside world out here, the outside of the cell. We'll say this is the inside. And I'm just taking this picture right here. If I just took a little piece of it right here. So here's the outside, here's the inside. And that little piece, you can see those phosphate heads on the inside are facing water. The phosphate heads on the outside are facing water. What about those fatty acid tails? They're trying to get as far away from water as possible. So they're right next to each other. They like each other. They just don't want to be near water. So they're trying to stay together. So it's a nice way to put these things together without having somebody actually do it. They'll form themselves like this. They like to be that way because those heads the heads want to be near water. Those tails want to be away from it. So they'll form that way on their own. Now, what comes next? And I'll just indicate this. I know you guys are trying to put away your book, but I have 2 minutes to go. We have all kinds of proteins. We'll have some proteins that are on the outside. We'll have some proteins that are on the inside. We'll have some proteins that stick through, We have some proteins that might stick all the way through. Maybe this protein sticks all the way through, all the way to here, So these would be proteins. So we have proteins that, that are on the inside, proteins on the outside, proteins that stick through. We have words for these, and I'll give that to you next time. We have all kinds of proteins. In the old days, they thought that, every cell membrane is like you have phospholipids, and you have a bunch of proteins. But what's different between one cell and the other is what proteins you have on the outside and the inside. Because that's what's going to make the difference between how that cell does things, what gets in that cell and what doesn't. Okay? So I'll stop at this point. We'll continue from here. All right?
All right. If this did work, do you have a problem with me posting it? Okay, well, if it works, I might post it and then make it available for other people.